Thank you everyone for coming and welcoming me with that torrential rainfall all day long. It's been quite an experience, but it's been lovely. To give you a roadmap of some of the overarching themes I'd love you to, that I hope that I convey in this next, I have 4 hours for this, right?
4 or 5.
4 or 5, okay. In this next time, are these. I want to share a little bit, and I was really excited to hear about some of the efforts on this campus and the interests of the students on this campus to make the geo and the health actually come a little bit closer together in terms of your practice and your training. I want to talk a little bit about community science. And I like you, and my message is it's not a niche tool. It actually can be a really critical academic framework to do research and teaching. I want to discuss the fact that although maybe as geoscientists we sort of feel useless in the health realm, I guarantee you health scientists don't understand anything about environmental processes whatsoever. And that is really a niche that we have, right? And it really is, and they welcome that. And finally, I'm going to show basically work over 20 years. Rome was not built in a day. I didn't get here in a day. It takes a little while. And I'd be happy to talk about, either informally afterwards or during a Q&A, about some of the processes one goes about as a scholar, engaging genuinely with communities in your own practice and your own research. As Damien mentioned, I didn't start off this way. I started off on a drill ship, and here I find myself working in soils in downtown Indianapolis and Chicago and other places, Zambia. It's all wonderful stuff to do, and it's very inspiring actually for me to be invited to be part of this and to have an audience. Lead poisoning is one of the great tragedies of the last century. And I'm saying last century, it's actually not over yet. But lead poisoning is one of these avoidable harms that we are faced with. This figure shows exactly the ravages of lead poisoning. This is a composite MRI of late adolescents. So they're asked some questions that involve memory, recall, short and long term, and everywhere where their neurons were not nearly as dense as a control person, they flash red. Why did they know this population was special? Well, they already knew that they were lead poisoned as children. So they were part of it's a long-term longitudinal study. We do these same things in earth sciences with observatories. This is just with human beings. So they had a set of people they knew were lead poisoned, and they tested them by the time they're about 19 or 20. And what they found, the most alarming thing of that, is all of those red and orange flashes are neural deficits, extremely low neural density, and they're all in the prefrontal cortex, right? Almost all of them. And the troubling part of that is that's what separates us from your dog, right? This is what provides us with ability to remember, ability to process, ability to avoid risky behavior if at all possible. So it's directly linked to those assets of IQ and learning potential that end up making a big economic actually impact on the lifespan. It ends up when you follow kids who are lead poisoned, and they've done this in a study in Dunedin, over the 30, 40, 50 years, their IQ actually continues to drop, to decline. And I'm going to talk about why that is in a little bit. But along with that IQ decline comes an economic deficit, right, that they bear. Not everyone who is lead exposed is lead harmed. If you think about that way, we all have sort of various ways in which we've sociologically been brought up, or our dietary intake is a little bit different, such that I know for a fact that I was lead poisoned by today's standards, because all of us old farts were. 99.8% of all people who are over 45 or so, and Damien, I'm looking at you, were affected by lead. And yet, we are still teaching college classes, right? But it is also true that if you look at the population as a whole, if you're lead exposed as a child, you do have poor educational outcomes later on. And I could chat about why there's that difference between the populations later. But the slide, I think the most important takeaway here is that lead exposure is extremely detrimental to us as human beings, and it's also permanent. That's what this is meant to note. These are people who were exposed not right then, but 15 years ago. So they're going to bear this intellectual disability for a lifetime. So I'm going to go through a couple of the process-related stuff. How does lead get into the body, into especially children's lives? And the reason why we care about child's lead poisoning versus adult lead poisoning. So children are, how many of you have children? Right? I have 4 of them. They're disgusting little organisms. They are very short. They spend a lot of time on the ground as toddlers. They stick their hands in their mouths as toddlers all the time. They actually eat a hell of a lot more dirt and expose themselves to a hell of a lot more dust than we do per body mass, right? And so they're ingesting a lot of material. And if that soil or dust has lead in it, as I'm going to show you a lot of it does, they have a tremendous lead intake potential. If they are, and their guts are also not very discriminating. So if a child has an empty stomach and they're exposed to lead, let's say they eat soil or dust, they absorb about 90% of it directly into their bloodstream. You and I, as adults, even on an empty stomach, we'd only absorb about 30 to 40% of it. On a full stomach, we'd only absorb about 5% of it. So children not only ingest a lot more of this stuff, they absorb a lot more, and the other third critical factor is the neurons are still forming, right? The prefrontal cortex is in its most active stage of development. And so it's a higher exposure and a much higher susceptibility just based on their age. The reason why we likely see a continued decline in intellectual ability from kids who are lead exposed is that 90% of that lead is stored in your bones. Our bones are made of hydroxyapatite. It doesn't care whether it's calcium or lead in the bloodstream. It'll take it in as the mineral structure, and it slowly leaks out over your lifetime. So if you've been exposed to a lot of lead as a child, you'll continue to leak out at a very slow rate. But even that slow rate is considered potentially part of the issue with these lifelong effects. One of my colleagues at Purdue University, actually, a microscopist, has developed a technique to use a very simple, you guys know what X-ray fluorescent spectrometers are? Now they're extremely common. There's a one special tuned one that you can actually measure bone lead through your tibia. Instead of taking a bone biopsy or waiting until you're dead, they just shoot this thing right through your tibia and give you a reflection of how much bone lead you might have. So that's how lead gets in the body. Why in the heck do we have lead in it? Well, it was phenomenal material. It made the best paint you could possibly imagine. Extremely durable, and that's why it was used so much in houses. There's lead white was a Dutch boy brand of paint in the 1920s and 30s. We also, Thomas Midgley Jr., who was responsible for creating the ozone hole, he also figured out if you put lead in gasoline, it's a wonderful anti-knock agent, and you can patent it. Ethanol works just as well, but you can patent tetraethyl lead. And so he developed that. And so this is the peak of lead really came about right when I was growing up, right? Exactly coincident with when I was growing up. And this is true throughout the U.S. You see this peak bolus of lead, and then a substantial decline. And normally, as a public health success, it was a great success story. Kids went from 98% of the population being lead poisoned to now less than 1% of the nationwide population. So less than 1%. That would be considered an amazing public health success. Most of that is by getting lead out of gasoline. EPA is still working on getting lead out of additional sources. There's a number of municipal airports around this area. There's also, municipal or small airplanes fly in and out of even big airports. They run on leaded gasoline still. So the EPA just issued a rule this week to eliminate, finally linking avgas, what it's called, to elevated blood lead levels in children who are downwind of the takeoff and landing pathways. So they're going to eventually get that out of there. So it's wonderful. We don't use lead anymore. And we've removed it from almost all products that we normally have. But many of you are chemists. You know the one thing about lead is it never goes away. And in fact, lead does not go away. So all of that lead, if you could integrate under that total curve, all that lead is still in our environment. It's still out there. And in fact, I'm going to show you it's not just theoretically out there, it's in surface soils around the country. That's because for the lead-based paint, my house is from 1915. And so 87% of homes have lead-based paint in the US that are older than 1940. Honestly, they still have it out there. It might be encapsulated, but it's still there. And we started phasing out lead from gasoline. So as a consequence, where do we see this lead-based paint lead? Well, I'm going to give you a couple snapshots of our citizen science tool, but for now I'm just going to break it down. On the left side is drip-line soils, so these are soils right beside your house. It's kind of close to your house. And on the right is soil that's out in the yard. And you can see that the drip-line soil is substantially higher than the yard soil. It's about twice as high. And much of that is just because of house paint, degraded house paint falling in your soils outside in your yard. So a lot of the lead that we see out there is near houses. A lot of the rest of the stuff is near roadways. This is an analysis that we did several years ago where we went into a couple parks, one urban park and one suburban park. The reason why we picked that is the urban park was in the downtown area of the city that has been virtually unchanged since 1910. And the suburban park was a new one from 1970 or so. So that was from when we used a lot of lead and gasoline and paint, and then when we stopped using lead and gasoline and paint. And you could see that in the light blue is the suburban setting. The normal amount of lead in soils is about 30 parts per million, just to give you like a frame of reference to what a normal number is, about 30. A little bit elevated, also show signs of lead and gasoline being used, but you notice that there's a little bit closer to the roadway, and it peters out a little bit. But in downtown, near that roadway, it also kind of peters out as you get away. But right next to the road, right now, this is 2019. You could take a sample of soil, surface soil, measure it, and it has 800 parts per million lead, even though the last time a car that was burning leaded gasoline went down that road was 50 years ago. Right? So it just tells you the persistence of lead in the environment. And most of that lead is actually stored in the surface sediment. And the reason why that's bad for us is that's where we live, that's where your kids play, that's where we garden, that's where wind that's blown across dry soils, that's where it generates dust from, right? So a lot of dust, a lot of lead in cities, a lot of it is near the surface. In fact, it's been hyper concentrated near the surface because of the chemistry of organic matter. So that's fine, that's the dynamics of lead. Well, where do we see it? And this has been a big effort that my lab has been focusing on the last 10 years. And you're going to see this a lot, developing a global map, global, mostly citizen science generated map of lead in the environment. And whether you're in old cities like New Orleans and Chicago, relatively smaller cities like Indianapolis, Sydney, Australia, South Bend, Indiana, you see the same kind of characteristic, which is high soil lead in the downtown areas and lower as the age of development is getting more and more recent. New Orleans is an amazing case study of that. And you'll see that those high soil lead values coincide with largely low-income African-American communities. And this theme will come up over and over again. So it's out there, and kids are getting exposed to it. Why do we know kids are getting exposed to it? Well, we can measure it now. This is and I want to talk to the people we were talking about the med school. It's called Dell Med School. They're a repository for this kind of data. This is blood lead level data of children from the age of 1 year to 5 years old. This is the city of Indianapolis. And a lot of health agencies have this kind of data. And so I was able to acquire it through certain agreements and map it. So I'm mapping out lead poisoned kids. These are lead poisoned kids right now in the city of Indianapolis. And everything that's red, the screening level now is 2.5 micrograms per deciliter. The number doesn't matter. Everything that's orange and red is a poisoned child or a set of poisoned children in the neighborhood. One thing that sticks out on a map like this, right, is it has it's not random. It's not a random distribution, right? It has a texture. It has a characteristic. And I'll show you that if you remember from the last map of soil lead, it's basically related to that. You'll see that there's a big valley in the middle of that green valley. That's our downtown, our university, our state capitol building, and our sports stadiums. No children live there, so you can't have an elevated blood lead level there. But You go to the near north side, near east side, near west side, near south side, it's all elevated blood lead. Public health professionals have had these maps for decades. So what do they do with those maps? Well, they do nothing with them. They actually don't display them even as a map because they're interested in census tracts. As an environmental scientist, I want to know where these kids are getting poisoned so you can get upstream of the problem, right? So what they do, a public health official, they maybe identify a few high-risk neighborhoods based on age of housing, like old houses here, young houses. Well, I'm going to focus on old houses. And then they wait till a child comes in with the elevated blood lead level. And then they put that child under case management. So then they intervene one child at a time. And I know we can do a hell of a lot better than that. I know that we can go to these sites and actually intervene and mitigate hundreds of children at a time. And so that's been a lot of my passion. And one of the kind of the early wins that we had was that public health officials didn't exactly know how kids were getting exposed. They thought, well, it's got to be paint chips. Ends up it's not paint chips. Yeah, paint chips cause dust, and improperly done, they cause, they fall in the soil. It's not always just the soil. It's what we figured out is mostly dust generated from these contaminated soils because it has a very seasonal signature. It is, when there's a dry period, particularly an extended dry period, you see a significant amount of local dust generated from urban environments. And we were able to model using atmospheric modeling, something called lead and air calculations, and seasonality and blood lead levels. I'm sorry, I should have told you one thing. All of these blood lead levels were taken just whenever the child came in. There's 12,000 data points here, but they came in all different kinds of years. So we were able to document a seasonal pattern in blood lead levels for the whole population. That seasonal pattern we can model perfectly with an aridity model. So every time it dries, dust was generated from contaminated soils. Kids were being exposed, and there you go. So that was one of the ways that we were able to bring a new environmental insight into lead poisoning. How does that help a clinician? Well, now a number of clinics are using this because now they're seeing, they get a blood lead test of a child, and it's, let's say, in February, right? Because children don't come in based on seasonality indicators that I produce. It's February. They now know that if that child's blood lead is below this action level in February, it was probably twice as high in August because that's when our seasonal pattern shows up in Indianapolis. So they know that they can they can reasonably expect to do a follow-up and start doing some more pointed clinical interventions. And their two health systems now are using this approach. They're checking the date. They never checked the date before, even though everyone knew there's a seasonal variation. It was like, well, you're above, you're bad, you're below, you're fine. Which is not, we don't think that way. And they've got a lot of other things to deal with. I understand that. But I think earth scientists can contribute substantially to this. There's also, you can't kind of overlook the substantial systemic racist part of this too. On the left is that same map. I just used one example map. On the right is the red line map of Indianapolis. Most cities had, at that point, legal ways to segregate cities to the don't invest there, and those became largely low-income African-American communities, and invest there, those became the more white communities, and then the Eisenhower freeway system came in and just supersized that. It's like, oh, okay, well, now we can use a map, and we know if we plow a superhighway or our highway through this area, no one's going to complain much because they don't have much social capital anymore. So that was then. This is now. We don't have those same built-in systemic racist practices. But that lead map looks just like that redlining map. I can show you a map of green density trees. It'll look exactly the same. And this is 80 years after we stopped using maps like this for real estate. Similarly, sorry about that wonky black lines. That's another paper. But that's a blood lead map viewed differently than I showed you 3 slides ago. It's the same map. It also overlays well with the red line map. Being a loudmouth, I certainly have not wanted to let this fact go. The fact that you can't just uniformly apply, take a fixed amount of money and help all communities with that. No, you need to start tipping the scale back toward equity. So you need to find the communities that are most vulnerable and have already had the most injury and deal with those. and this was, so I'm still very passionate about that. Not only, I'm just going to throw one other, GeoHealth. This is not just a pitch for GeoHealth, this is a journal, although it should be. We also can do the same map of heat, extreme heat in Indianapolis, and you see the same pattern, unfortunately. So the people who are being lead exposed, they also have much higher local heat and a lot higher particulate matter concentrations. So that's a triple whammy of bad things for your health. So how have we begun solving this? I knew that we couldn't solve this by me going out and knocking on doors and saying, can I please collect 3 samples of soil and 1 sample of dust from your house and maybe a paint, and could you please make sure your dog doesn't eat me, and all of that. And oh, by the way, I'm a white dude coming to largely African American community. Trust me, I'm sure I'll do good stuff with your data. Right? I knew that wasn't going to work, and I think that the only reason I didn't do that is that I had really good community mentors, community health mentors from the med school say, cool your engines here a little bit. If you're going to do real community engaged science, sit down, meet with communities, go to their community meetings, go break bread with them, hear what their problems are, and listen and try to respond to their issues. And I had the luxury of tenure to be able to do that. Nevertheless, a lot of universities are starting to transform the way they value faculty work as well. But I'm going to show you sort of a step-by-step process of how we walk through this. And the way we walk through it first is we found one particular community with very high blood lead levels. It happened to be right next to campus. And we took advantage of a large push toward urban gardening, a citywide push toward urban gardening, especially community gardening. And we thought, well, let's work with the community gardeners and let's sneak in also to the association meetings and see if we can have a lot of them become our citizen scientists. So what that means is that we would provide them with very simplistic kits, not simplistic because they're not smart, they are smart, they're just not our scientists, right? Kits to take their own samples, and we would collect the samples and analyze them and provide them with the data. And they're like, really? You'll give the data back to me? And you know why they were so surprised? Everyone else comes to them, takes data and publishes it in Science or Nature or PNAS, and that's it. And it has to be that bilateral exchange. And I've been guilty of not doing that adequately myself. I'm not saying that I'm an expert. I'm still learning on this. So we started getting really serious about this, and we started doing really a deep dive into soil lead. And this is an example from that community where we found that, blood lead's high. And why is that? Well, there's a ton of hot spots for soil lead. And these were all citizen science generated. Some of these hot spots, for example, I don't know if I can show it. Are you seeing a squiggly thing? This right here was a community garden that they wanted to put in. And the normal amount of soil lead is 30 parts per million. The EPA limit for safe gardening is 200 parts per million, which is way too liberal, but we can talk about that later. These were at about 4,000 parts per million, right? Patently unsafe for people to be gardening directly in the soil. So we worked with them and got them services to do raised bed gardening and so forth. But we identified something else here that we never would have before. This area down here is labeled the Avanti Superfund site. Right there's a lead smelter where my cursor is that had been operating and failing for about 40 or so years. It was a resmelter, so they were taking old lead batteries and stuff and melting them and making new lead. It was finally recognized as a community hazard and it was on the national priorities list and then got cleaned up as a Superfund location. They took all of that dirt and just dumped it next door. This is the dirt pile. Nevertheless, their dirt pile is actually relatively well contained, so I'm not going to diss them. They don't have anywhere else to dump this crap, right? So they put it on that pile. It's relatively sealed-ish. And they said, job done. But I noticed that this area still had a lot of high blood lead levels in it. And I thought, well, you cleaned up the area. Why is that? Well, it ends up that they left a lot behind. So this was a citizen scientist who were like, this is particularly a group of high school students who did this as a capstone project 2 years in a row. They came back the first year finding some high lead values. I'm like, this is strange. I know this was a cleanup site. Go back again and do some more of this. And so they did some more of this. And we also installed a filter down here, a house filter. And what we recognized is that the cleanup was improper because it wasn't adequate. That house filter had the highest household lead of any area that we had here. The community said, well, what could you go to the EPA? And I said, well, actually, it's not me to go to the EPA. I'll give you all the contact information. You go to the EPA because you're the community who's being burdened. And you'll have a much more powerful voice. So they did that. They went to the EPA. The EPA didn't believe them because it's, who's this Filipelli, Yahoo. But they came down anyway and did a reassessment, and they realized, oh, we didn't clean up very well, did we? And so they did a second clean out 4 years ago, and a third one they're just finishing this summer to get the bits and pieces that they didn't get the first two. So sometimes this community action, especially if you give the data to the communities who are burdened, it can be a very powerful tool to actually get action that we don't normally see. This inspired the fact that, I've been villainizing urban gardening, like, ooh, your soil's contaminated. Well, you need to give solutions. You can't just say, don't garden, go to the, to the Kroger instead. You might not have Kroger's. Anyway, a supermarket instead. And so we provided them with some tools, some tools that they could do. And this tool is a guide to safer urban gardening, but it also has a link to get free soil testing. Not just from our lab, but also from the health department, which we've partnered with in this. So they've also set aside some money for that. One of our key partners, I mentioned a youth partnership program. One of our key partners was a local, 3 different programs that had youth leadership fellows in them. So they're kids, they're like from 15 to 22. They have them do various environmental things in the city. Most of them are African Americans serving community groups. And we had them do be our partners. And the reason why I thought that was really important, not just our partners, I gave them a bunch of money to double the number of fellows they had. The reason why I thought that was important is that these kids grow up and live in these communities, not me. I live in a different community than they do. And so if they were approaching houses, not only is it their community, but they can become local experts. So they're 15 to 20, they can become local experts. And the reason I think it's hilarious that this kid, this is Chio Moafrica, he was probably a little bit on the spectrum by modern, well, many people are these days, but he was extremely earnest about, so he did this whole video about how you collect soils, and I thought, wow, this kid's gonna go places, and then this was about 6 years ago. And then this last winter, we were doing a big climate event in Indianapolis, a big symposium, and here across the way comes Chio Moafrica, who is now a senior at our university, who had never even set foot on a university campus before being part of the project. So I think you also can't forget the power that you have as an educational institution to introduce community to what can be done, what is the potential. And he wasn't not just inspired by me, but he's inspired by being part of this, part of a solution rather than just documenting a problem. And this group also had some other phenomenally interesting insights. One of them is that they produced a whole campaign, which is really cool. And I want to check on time because I want to make sure I'm being respectful. They also did one of the scientifically frustrating projects, but it was really important. I told them about my concern about a lot of these unlicensed daycares. They're informal daycares. They're not licensed because it costs money to license. They're a corner house that happens to have, helps working moms, usually working moms out when they're juggling many jobs and they have kids and they need a safe place to bring them home, put their kids. Licensed daycares have to have lead testing. These things were, a lot of the housing was probably kind of substandard by my estimation. So I was telling the kids this in this group, and I wish we can get testing there, but they don't want testing. So they took that in, and I thought, well, why do they even need to be tested if we know that one intervention to remove a child from being exposed to dirt is to put a heavy mulch layer over the dirt, right? It doesn't solve it forever, but it solves it for now. And that's what they did. They had a truck that they had access to. They got a bunch of free mulch and had a mulching day. So they mulched 20. It was a mulching weekend actually. They mulched about 20 childcare programs. And I'm like, did you get samples before so we can measure? Like, no, they don't need to be. We know it works because it does work. So we missed a scientific opportunity, but nevertheless, I guess the impact was made. And the reason why I think it's really important for us to think about bringing community in is the self-efficacy aspect. that group that got an EPA cleanup, a re-cleanup for the third time of their location, they actually are now local experts, and they're writing grants to the bipartisan infrastructure bill to get money to now work on their water infrastructure, right? So they've gained agency in their own future. I'm going to just walk through a couple of other programs we've done, which are super fun. So this is all stuff that happened over the last 8 years. This next stuff is stuff we're doing actually over the last year and into the future. And one of them is to expand our repertoire of what we do. So we developed, and a grad student actually coded, a citizen science platform. It's a web service called Map My Environment, all one word, mapmyenvironment.com. And it's a way for people to learn about environmental quality, learn about something called their exposomes, which is what you are exposed to in your given life course, right, in a given day, and to provide resources to help you determine, let's say if you're interested in your soil lead and you live in Australia, well, you click on it and you get a QR code to sign up for lead testing in Australia. Similarly, in North America, you get it to sign up for our lead testing, and in the UK and so forth. So we launched this about 3 years ago, normal pandemic launch. But since then, we've been able to get, in North America, we're at about 17,000 soil samples that we have now all over North America. Most of it's from the US, a little bit from Mexico and Canada. Australia, they have over 4,000 soil samples. Dust samples is a newer project. We have almost 1,000. Actually, we have well over 1,000 now because this is data from last month. We got a whole slug of them. And with this, it's a way for people to start visualizing their environment. And I think because we've established our program, we now get data from other sources. Got a bunch of data from the USGS recently, a bunch of city-specific data from the EPA, and now data from other colleagues. As long as it's geolocated, we can host it. We saw a lot of opportunity in this, and it didn't hurt. We have a bunch more dust stuff because we've gotten highlighted quite a bit in kind of larger things that people read, not GeoHealth, but actually Washington Post. And we've decided to now branch out. This is just a fun little side shoot. Branch out into also using that indoor dust repository. We keep all those dust samples, so we have all of them in the lab. And so now we can play with other things with them. It's like 23andMe, right? You give your saliva, and they'll keep having new things. Hey, you want to find out, when you're going to die? So next year or not? You can click on this button. Kind of cheek a little bit. So we took this opportunity. A colleague who's an expert on weird organic chemistry, particularly compounds inside homes. She thought, well, I have a bunch of samples I just got from COVID lockdown of these quats, quaternary ammonium compounds. They're cleaning compounds, and a bunch of cleaning products you have. They happen to also be toxic. But she has a bunch of them from during COVID lockdown. She's curious, are they higher or lower than in the past? So she reached out to me, and we have archived samples of all of this. I gave her a set of our archived samples, and we were able to compare before and after. It ends up that during COVID lockdown, we doubled the indoor air concentration of quarks. Because we were cleaning everything like maniacs, because we didn't know what was going to kill us during that time. Before we really recognized that there's mainly a respiratory thing. So this is as far as and my colleagues in the UK have added antimicrobial resistance to their dust samples. I have not done that yet in the US, mainly bandwidth and funding. But we have a proposal in right now to do mold and nicotine using our samples, our stored samples. So how has this informed science? I've talked a lot about informing community health. How does this inform science? Well, a number of very unexpected things came out of this. This is not unexpected. What we found is that the outside of your home looks a lot like the inside of your home when it comes to lead. What's outside is kind of what's inside. It makes some sense because 60% of your dust inside your house comes from outside your house. But it does help us, helps advertise some simple things, like you should probably leave outside, meaning you probably should leave your shoes. You probably shouldn't wear your shoes inside the house because not only do they have a lot of gross stuff, but they might also have lead and every other heavy metals. But it doesn't work for zinc. There's a lot of, this was just a Sydney example because they have a higher density of dust samples than we do, my colleague Mark Taylor. But yeah, a lot of zinc inside the house, not much outside the house. We've written about some of our ideas about some of the zinc compounds that I'll refer you to in a second. Similar story with copper. Copper looks great when you look, lead looks great, copper doesn't make much sense. But when we look at now, because we have about 6,000 dust samples, over 8,000 dust samples from around the world, we're able to make some kind of some analysis, and we're starting to understand a little bit of why this is. So we came up with this analysis, and it ends up that we've been able to verify this by using lead isotopes versus copper isotopes. The dynamics of lead transport inside the home is just simply different than the copper. It's being transported on different particles, intriguingly. So citizen science still works for real science. So I guess that's the point of these slides. You can actually make some scientific advances. The criticisms will always remain the same. I tell you, okay, why don't you take 3 samples, one by your drip line, one in the middle of your yard, one by the street, and give me a vacuum sample. You're going to interpret that as you interpret it, right? Even if I show you like an IKEA-like picture of how you take those, which we do. But are you going to dig to the exact same level of soil that Damien does? Maybe not, because your interpretation of that. Do you have the same vacuum cleaner? No, probably not. So there is always going to be that criticism of non-controlled science, but once you get 6,000 or 8,000, or in the case of soil, 20,000 data points, it all normalizes to a mean of some kind, right? So once you have enough data, you can get some understanding. It's just I wouldn't advocate making great assumptions based on 3 data points, right? You need more. That's all. We've developed 5 different ways to translate this research to normal human beings. This is just one of the many, but the key is that this can't just end up, sorry, I'm going to go back. It can't end up in ES&T. My mom doesn't read ES&T, your neighbor doesn't either. And certainly the people we give these reports to don't either. So we've worked on many ways to translate it. This is probably one of the weaker aspects of what we've done, even though we've involved a lot of community engaged folks about this, but we're working on it. And finally we're able to sort of reflect a little bit on what works with community science in the terms of the heavy metals, which has been our focus, and maybe what doesn't work as well. I think it's really important to kind of keep that mindset, because not everything works great. We've been playing around now with a couple new initiatives, which I'll talk about in my last 3 slides. One of them is the Bookworms Initiative. I take no credit for any of these things because these are all my grad students. This is PhD student John Shukla, who said, well, I wonder if we can use earthworms as a biomonitor also. And so we pitched this idea and got funding to start off the Bookworms Initiative, where we work with schools and teachers, only interested teachers, and we say, we can provide you with kits for soil, and we can provide you with kits for worms. Again, kids are gross, so they love picking up worms and putting them in bags. And so we did the science behind it. We know that worms who live on high leaded soils end up being leaded, and also the other metals compared to non-leaded soils. And the whole idea of bookworms is that if the classroom got enough worms and paired soils, then they would get a coupon for a free book. We have this partnership with Barnes & Noble, not National Barnes & Noble, just our local one. And one of the reasons why maybe I wasn't as impacted growing up as maybe somebody who didn't have the same resources I had is that, even though I was lead poisoned for sure, I had a full belly, and I had a lot of reading and active learning going around outside in my environment, which helps you maintain some kind of malleability in your neural systems as you're growing up, in a sense. So this is not only a way to investigate the science of lead, of environmental lead, but it's also a way to intervene, right? They're giving a book, right? So it's both detection and intervention technique. All of our kits are very simple. You take a soil, You take some worms, you put in the worms literally in baggies of kitty litter. So it's a low cost, it's little baggies. You send them back to us. We use a little bit of liquid nitrogen, freeze the worms, crush them, and run them by a very simple X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. Similarly to soil, we share the data with the classroom, and the classroom then reflects with their teacher, like, how does this, how does lead get from soil into earthworms? It ends up that probably a lot of it is actually not in their tissues, probably just in their guts. They're just big earthworms have bigger guts, and so we're analyzing the whole damn thing, right? The worm and the soil, but nevertheless, it tends to work. And because students are always strange individuals, as you guys know who are advisors, I had a student who was like, I wonder if there's any lead in birds. Birds eat worms. So that's what she started. So she's now in her second year of project where she's looking at mapping out urban versus rural American robins. Just because robins are ubiquitous across all of North America, Central and North America. So we have samples from Alaska, from Central U.S., and robins during a certain time of year, 90% of their protein comes from eating worms, earthworms. So we catch the birds, we kill them and bleed them. No, we catch the birds, take a little tiny sample of blood out of them, put a little backpack, a tracker backpack on them. They look kind of cool, like those Norwegian backpacks, those scarf full or whatever you call those little cool backpacks. And then send them off on their way, and so they're fine, honestly. Maybe pissed off for a little bit, but they're just a bird. And we measure their blood lead values, right? And we're starting to map that out. And so what we found is that, yes, urban robins are leaded. They have higher blood lead levels than most children do. So they're getting a substantial lead load. And we are trying to figure out whether it has any harmful health impacts for the birds. We haven't got to that part yet. We're still at just mapping the distribution. And our idea is that our Alaskan robins will have lower blood lead than our Midwest robins. And that's so far panned out. We don't have enough data to say for sure because we're waiting on Alaska data. The student, of course, because students are weird, she's like, oh, I wonder if it changed in the past. So because back then we had a lot of leaded gasoline, right? We don't have that so much anymore. So now she's going through archives and getting old bone samples, beaks, claws, and bones, and she's running them with a new micro XRF to figure out lead in old bones from the 1910s and the 70s and the aughts, I think. And then comparing them to another initiative that we have on campus, a bird strike initiative, where we're basically picking up dead birds and counting them. Buildings kill a ton of birds. I mean, what Chicago Millennium, whatever that McCormick Convention Center, which I was just at for AGU last year, it killed 10,000 birds in one night. But yeah, buildings are not great for birds. But her idea, so she's taking now these bird bones from current dead birds and grinding them up and analyzing them as well. So there's a bunch of things you can do that maybe are sparked by the citizen science engagement and then bring it through the spectrum. The reason I think this is important, and I'm going to end on this, is that I care a lot about how lead gets into the biological ecosystem, right? Human ecosystem, sorry, us. It's also important to think about the other organisms, right? And this is an interesting view into how does lead get into a different kind of ecosystem, and how might it be impacting that ecosystem? So with that, I welcome you to visit the site. I didn't show you this at the beginning because you would have just not listened to me, which would have been fine too. I also welcome you to contact me via email or yell at me by Twitter. A lot of people do, so you would be just joining a vast pool of Twitter haters out there. But thank you very much for your interest. Let me lead, let me orchestrate. Yes.
Have you ever looked at arsenic in the soils? We had groundwater arsenic contamination, and people thought it was arsenical pesticides on cotton.
Yeah.
But when we looked at the soils, it was just right at the top. And so places like cotton gins and other things nearby, ended up arsenic right near the surface.
So I've only showed the lead data and zinc and copper, but we do all of that array. So we have arsenic data. Arsenic correlates very well with lead, with one caveat. We use the detector we use is an XRF, X-ray fluorescence, and there's a significant overlap between the peaks that you get for lead and for arsenic. So I don't trust our arsenic numbers very much, so I don't tend to publish them. But everywhere I get, and it comes up first on the XRF when I do a scan, it's like high arsenic, like that's going to have high lead. Whether it's from instrumental overlap or from reality, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Great talk.
Thank you.
So the more we know, the more we start questioning. And when you have such data, and then you start seeing that there could be confoundings from, say, the kind of material that is being used or the kind of activities are being done. And when the community starts looking at it and sort of slice and dice, how do you keep the message simple?
Yeah. It's one of our huge challenges because, so for a slight detour, I'm going to explain what's happening in the state of Indiana right now because it gets to the point of how do you keep it simple. And in the state of Indiana, we're behind most states, including probably Texas, in most of the things we do in general, including environmental protection. But we had a public health chief who said, we need to get up to date with the national standards for blood testing. We were still using a screening level that was about 20 years old. So she said, I'm going to get money, we're going to do a pilot project, and we're going to have universal testing of all 1-year and 2-year-olds, every child. That has its own challenge because pediatricians don't even order lead tests anymore. They don't bother because it's about 1% of kids call it high, except in these urban populations where it's about 10. But regardless, we knew, so the health department came to us and said, we're going to get a ton of kids who are going to, a ton of parents who are going to have a number now for their child. Many of them are not going to be 0, and they're not going to know how to interpret this. And so what is a simple message that you can provide to parents? And our response is, well, you need to provide them something beyond, oh, your child will be fine, or your child's kind of going to be messed up, right? So what our effort is right now is we're making these citizen science environmental kits much simpler. So they'll be given out to every child offered to every child who gets one of these tests. And they'll get the analysis, we'll run the analysis, and we'll run the reports for them. So that if we can figure out, oh, you actually have a lead paint at home, and here's a link to services. I think you just have to, yeah, people don't care about the nuances of this. People want to know, what do I have a problem and how do I fix it? And that's been the biggest challenge. You can't just tell them, oh, you've got a problem, and then walk away. And this is, the health departments are really good about this. They say, you can't just come with a problem, you have to have a solution also. So they've been really invaluable for teaching me about how to better message. And you know, we'll see how that kind of pans out. It ends up that with this universal testing, we're also reducing the screening level. So this came up a lot. Again, I don't want to just talk about stuff we did, but about a month ago, a story came out in the Atlantic where a reporter had this very problem of her child tested positive, but not at a level in California. She's in Alameda, California, not at a level that they would have to intervene. She spent $20,000 finding where the lead is and eradicating it, and she fully recognized, and being freaked out in the meantime, but she's fully cognizant of the fact that she's probably going way overboard. So she's a writer, so she thought, well, I'm going to pitch this idea to Atlantic, and Atlantic says, yeah, write a story about that. So she wrote a story, you can look it up, this last month, I think, or something, where she talked to a bunch of us, talked to me a lot about how a normal person should manage that concern. You know, it ends up that, like my first story, a lot of us were lead poisoned when we were kids. Not everyone is doomed. But again, all she wanted to know was there services, and California didn't give her any services. They said, oh, your kid's probably going to be fine. And that was all. Yeah, Chris.
Great talking.
Thank you.
So the first thing I saw was community gardening, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of been pushed very heavily in the last 20 years, especially in the inner city in terms of nutrition, especially for socioeconomically challenged groups. But your message essentially don't, right? I mean, it's probably not the smartest thing to do. So that's my first question. And the second question, I guess, is like, yeah, okay, I worry about lead. Okay, maybe for me it's too late too, right? And I worry about temperatures in inner cities, but I also worry about microplastics, which are also in the soil. I mean, have you thought about expanding this in your samples to you already have, maybe microplastics?
To the latter, yes, I would love to. I'm not a microplastics expert, so point me to one, and that would be great. To your first one, fortunately, I don't tell them not to garden. That was that safe gardening guide. I say, just take some cautions. In fact, most people instinctively, they do garden in the right way, which is they tend to augment their soil with a compost, or they do in raised beds. And that automatically solves a lot of the problem. And also, there's a strange misconception about lead exposure and lead mitigation. I keep getting things sent to me. Oh, fungi can help suck out lead from soil. Sunflowers can suck out lead from soil. Mustard can help suck out lead from soil. None of it works. You can't suck out lead from soil using a phytoremediation. You just have to separate the soil from the plant. What we do say in that guide, though, is even if you have raised bed gardening and you have super high soil lead concentrations nearby, that lead's going to make its way onto your garden bed. So we recommend against leafy greens, which actually leafy greens have the highest amount of lead in them. Not because they absorb it, just because if you look at a lettuce under a microscope, not that anyone normally would have reason to, they have a bunch of these little hairs along them. They catch a lot of fine dust. And the other thing is root vegetables, and that makes a lot of sense, right? They're growing kind of within the media. Tomatoes, fine. Cucumbers, fine. Just wash out sides of the wall. But microplastics, I like to get there. I'm going to get up there and then to you. Yeah. Decide. Arm wrestle.
I guess you were talking about the distribution of lead in cities, but is there like a distribution across the nation? Like certain communities have more, some have less, like terminal drainage basins, or New York City or something like that?
There's not been adequate, so it's an excellent question, and the data exists distributed around various agencies, but it's not ever shared on a national platform. So this is why we started doing this. We said, let's make a national platform so that people can put their data in. And EPA, the national EPA is paid attention, and so I'm on a small steering committee where we're developing this, what we call a participatory soil-led set of workshops, and we're going to talk about this data issue. So EPA wants to sort of nationalize our website. Maybe not ours. It might turn into something else, just to provide access to a lot of those resources. It ends up that a lot of times there's a ton of these soil shops people do, where they bring in an analysis, people bring in the soil, and it's informal, it's educational. None of that data is ever recorded anywhere, where it's told to the parent and then it's gone, right? And that's a huge opportunity. So I'll tell you, in generalities, older cities have higher lead than younger cities. I mean, that's a generality. But we don't, even Los Angeles has a significant lead problem in big parts of Los Angeles, even though I would consider that somewhat younger city. So such a map doesn't exist, but we want to make sure it does.